There are over 300 figures in Michelangelo's Last Judgment: popes, saints, angels, the damned being dragged into hell, Christ at the center, one arm raised, deciding the fate of every soul that has ever lived. It covers the entire altar wall of the Sistine Chapel, 48 feet wide, 44 feet tall, the most scrutinized surface in the history of Western art, and hidden inside it, in a place that took 400 years to fully understand, is Michelangelo's own face. Not a proud self-portrait in a corner, not a cameo where the artist looks out at you with a knowing expression. What Michelangelo painted was his own face on a piece of dead skin, hanging from the hand of a saint, dangling over hell, a flaccid, emptied-out sack of human flesh with his features pressed into it, scowling, hollow-eyed, the face of a man who has already been separated from his own body. Most writers agree that Michelangelo depicted his own face in the flayed skin of St. Bartholomew. No 16th century critic noticed it. He put himself in the most visible painting in Christendom. He hid himself as a dead man's skin, and for 4 centuries no one saw it. Subscribe to Carrara. We find what was meant to stay hidden. Michelangelo was 61 years old when he began the Last Judgment. He had already painted the Sistine ceiling, a project so physically brutal that he spent 4 years on his back on scaffolding, working with paint dripping into his eyes, and emerged with permanent damage to his vision and posture. He had not wanted to paint the ceiling either. He considered himself a sculptor, not a painter, and the commission had been forced on him by Pope Julius II. 25 years later, another pope, Clement VII, commissioned him back to the same chapel to paint the altar wall. Michelangelo was by this point the most famous artist in the world, old enough to refuse and deeply unhappy about returning. By the time he actually began painting in 1536, delayed by Clement's death and the insistence of his successor, Paul III, Michelangelo had returned to Florence to resume work for the Medicis. In the years that followed, galvanized by the sack of Rome, the citizens of Florence ousted the ruling Medici family. Michelangelo found himself imprisoned, sentenced to death, and eventually reprieved. He came back to the Sistine Chapel as a man who had nearly been executed, who had spent years watching everything he valued collapse, whose faith was in crisis, whose body was failing, and who believed, with the specific terror of a devout 16th century Catholic, that his soul was in genuine danger. The Last Judgment was not a commission for Michelangelo. It was a confession. Saint Bartholomew was one of the 12 apostles. According to tradition, he was martyred in Armenia by being flayed alive, his skin removed from his body while he still lived. In art, he is almost always depicted holding the instrument of his martyrdom. In Michelangelo's version, that attribute is his own skin. A massively muscular St. Bartholomew clutches his own lifeless skin, a reference to his being flayed to death by his persecutors. The flaccid, fleshy sack conceals an amazing secret self-portrait. The sagging, lifeless features are those of none other than Michelangelo himself. But the placement is not random. Look at where the skin hangs in the composition. Bartholomew stands just below Christ, directly in the zone between the saved, rising to heaven on the left, and the damned falling to hell on the right. The proximity of the flayed Michelangelo's self-portrait to the devils and the damned is perhaps a comment on the artist's concerns for his judgment. He is suspended in limbo between Christ and the devil. Michelangelo painted himself not among the saved, not among the damned, but as an empty skin, a body without a soul, hanging in the balance, not yet decided. Edgar Wynne saw this as a prayer for redemption, that through the ugliness, the outward man might be thrown off, and the inward man resurrected pure. The man who painted the most famous ceiling in the history of art did not know if he was going to heaven, and he put that uncertainty directly into the painting, visibly, permanently, in the place closest to God's judgment. And for 400 years, no one saw it. The self-portrait in the flayed skin is the most discussed hidden detail in the Last Judgment, but it is not the only one. When the Pope's own master of ceremonies, Biagio da Cesena, visited the chapel while Michelangelo was still painting and declared that the nude figures were disgraceful, that it was no work for a papal chapel, but rather for the public baths and taverns. Michelangelo responded by painting Cesina's face onto the figure of Minos, judge of the underworld, in the bottom right corner of the fresco. When Cesina complained to the Pope, the pontiff responded that his jurisdiction did not extend to hell, so the portrait would have to remain. The face of Bartholomew himself, the saint, not the skin, is believed to be a portrait of Pietro Aretino, another critic who had attacked Michelangelo's depiction of nudity in a sacred space. The man holding Michelangelo's dead skin is painted as his enemy, and there is one more detail that makes the entire construction more disturbing. The knife that Bartholomew holds, the instrument of flaying, is not a knife, but a sculpting file, a tool used by sculptors to polish marble surfaces. The saint is holding Michelangelo's face in one hand, and in the other, he is holding a sculptor's tool. The enemy is holding the dead artist's skin and the artist's own instrument. Whether this is self-punishment, dark humor, or something more theologically complex, Michelangelo never explained. He left no note, he left only the painting. Subscribe to Carrara. The greatest artists always leave more than they say. The Last Judgment was unveiled on Christmas Day, 1541. It was widely accepted as a masterpiece. The controversy about the nudity began almost immediately. The fig leaf campaign that saw Michelangelo's pupils painting clothes onto the saints lasted for centuries. During the restoration of the 1980s and 1990s, about half of the censorship was removed. The self-portrait in the flayed skin was noticed by a few scholars in the 16th century, and then essentially forgotten. It re-entered art historical discussion seriously in the 19th century and was confirmed through comparison with known Michelangelo portraits in the 20th. By the time the fresco was restored in the 1990s, the identification was universally accepted. What is still not fully resolved is the question of intent. Was this a private act of humility, a man positioning himself as unworthy, suspended between salvation and damnation, asking for mercy? Was it a public declaration of suffering, an artist who felt flayed by his patrons and critics making that metaphor literal and permanent? Was it something theological, the separation of the sinful flesh from the hopeful soul, painted into the doctrine of the Last Judgment itself? Michelangelo was 67 when he finished it. He lived another 23 years, long enough to see the controversy, long enough to watch the critics and the censors and the fig leaf painters. He never commented on the hidden face. He never denied it. He never explained it. He painted his own face as dead skin, hanging between heaven and hell in the most watched room in the world, and he left it there for everyone to find or miss. For 400 years, almost everyone missed it. The face is still there, in the same position, in the same chapel, dangling from the same hand, still unresolved.